Good morning.
Good morning.
Last week we spoke about chains, right? We spoke about the fact that God has given us the power and the privilege to have our chains taken away, to be freed from the things that bind us and hold us down. We've been studying Acts. We've been looking at the early church and examining what they experienced and what we can learn from them. And we recognize, Lord, that they too had chains that they had to lift up to you, just as we do. So I want to speak a little bit about the freedom this morning that we have once He has taken those chains away. I hope you caught what I just did. I'm speaking to you this morning, and right in the middle of it, I speak to Him. There's a key significance to that little catch there. I want you to hold on to. We'll come back to it. When you have the chains taken off and freedom comes, the question becomes, what do we do with it? What do we do with the newfound freedom that God has given us? Because there are a lot of things you can do with freedom. And we know this from watching the exercise of freedom in people all over the world. Not everyone has the opportunity to do that, of course, but we watch many people to see what they do with the freedom given to them. And unfortunately, we see also what happens when people misuse the freedom. Just like we see the oppression that keeps people from being able to exercise their freedom. Some of that has to do with ourselves. Our choice, our choosing what to do with freedom. Some of that has to do with things we can't control. What is placed upon us, allowed or disallowed. Our calling is to follow Jesus. Our calling is to use the freedom He has given us for His purposes. Our calling is to demonstrate our gratitude for the freedom He's given us by seeking to use it the way He's designed for it to be used. In all situations. You may remember the story that's told toward the end of Genesis. You remember the patriarchs. You had Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And they were one of the early attempts God made to try to reconnect with people. We've been cast out of the garden, you know. We've been cast out of God's presence in a sense because we rebelled. And God had begun His attempt to draw us back in. He had begun His attempt to identify a people that could be identified with Him, that others, the rest of us, would be able to look at and see what it looks like. What does it look like in real life to be a part of this God, to be counted as His people, and for Him to be our God, in the midst of a lot of other gods worshipped, right? And so you begin to watch this family interact with God and each other and trying to figure out what does this look like. And you get down to Joseph, who was one of the children of Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph experienced some dreams. And in these dreams, God gave him visions of what was going to happen in the future. Now, a lot of times when God gives us things, He has a plan for how we're to use them, and we don't always use them quite appropriately. And some would say that Joseph maybe misused what he was given because he couldn't wait to go tell his brothers, hey, guess what? This is what God has told me. And the way he presented it very much made him look good and them not so good. And you know what brothers tend to do to brothers anyway, let alone when one has told them, check me out, and oh well for you, even though that's not exactly what he said. And so they did him in, right? If you know the story. They found a way to get rid of him, and they sold him into slavery. And at this point, you would think, wow, freedom gone. Is it? I invite you to turn with me to Genesis chapter 39, where we're looking at this story, and we pick it up at a certain place. Joseph has been sold. He's now in the land of Egypt because he's been sold to Potiphar, the Egyptian officer, a captain of the guard of the Pharaoh at that time. And so that's where we pick it up at the beginning of 39, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. The part I want you to grab onto this morning is that the Lord was with Joseph. Now, that's not hard to pick up by itself. In isolation, you read that verse and you think, well, great, okay, the Lord is with Joseph. Everything went well, apparently. He succeeded. But remember where Joseph is when this is written. He's in captivity. He's been sold. His freedom is gone by all standards that we consider free. He's in slavery. He's bound to do what another tells him to do. One who doesn't even hold his same values. One who worships a totally different God. And yet, the narrator tells us that the Lord was with him and he succeeded in everything he did. As you begin to read this story, you realize that part of what Joseph did was he did well what he was asked to do. He took on the responsibility he was given, and he did it as unto the Lord, you might say, because he didn't rebel, he didn't buck, he didn't kick back. He just did what he was told to do, and he tried to do it well and responsibly. Well, that's what we do when the Lord is with us. That's what we do when he's made an impact in our life. That's what we do when he is our God and we are his people. We attempt with everything we have to follow him and do what he's asked us to do. There's a freedom in that I want you to catch this morning. Because even though he's in slavery and even though he is doing what he's told to do, maybe what he's doing he doesn't have the freedom to just say, I'm not doing it. But he has the freedom to determine how he does it and why he does it. In other words, for whom he really does it. It's an important point for us to consider this morning as we find ourselves in a lot of instances where we have to do things that are not what we would choose to do. Someone else has told us to do it. Maybe we're not in slavery, but we are under the supervision of someone else. And we have to do what they've told us to do. Maybe we're not even in employment situation with them. Maybe we just live in a place where there's government over us. And I'm not talking about oppressive dictatorship. I'm talking about democratically elected government. And they put rules in place that they expect us to follow. And for many of us, you may have experienced this as well, whether it's in business or education or government or wherever. You're asked to do things that everybody is asked to do, but you disagree with it. It's not what you would choose. It's not according to your values. It's not even the way you would do it if you wanted to do it. But it's a part of what's required of you. Do you have freedom in this instance? Well, you can follow Joseph's lead. We can take into account that he had to do what he had to do, but he had a choice on how he was going to do it. We pick up the story down in verse 6. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing, except what kind of food to eat. In other words, he had complete confidence in this slave, this one he'd bought, this one who we would say had no freedom at all. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him in a way she shouldn't have been looking at him. And the invitation comes. Come with me. It's funny that in a situation of freedom this morning, we talk about temptation. Because the fact is that we were created to be free people. And we have been given a lot of freedoms. And one of the greatest enemies to freedom is not necessarily having to do what we're told that we don't want to do. One of the greatest obstacles to really experiencing and expressing our freedom is what we do with the temptation and trials that come. Our choosing, our decision. He's succeeding. He's doing well. He's got the complete trust of his master. And then all of a sudden, this temptation comes. Joseph refused. He said, look, my master trusts me in everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held nothing back from me except you, because you're his wife. How can I do such a wicked thing? Do you hear the freedom exercised? Do you hear the value that doesn't match up with a world that says, you're enslaved, man. You've been sold. Get back at this guy in any way you can. You don't have to put up with this junk. Hey, you got an opportunity here. But we have freedom. We have a freedom to decide how we're going to do and for whom we're going to do what we're told to do. And Joseph says, I'm not about to do this. Even though he's enslaved, even though he's been sold, he has a surprising respect for the one who controls him. She kept putting pressure on him day after day, and he kept refusing. He kept out of the way as much as possible. We've been taught that, right? When temptation gets too heavy, avoid it. Stay out of the way. That's wise advice. But sometimes we find ourselves in a place like Joseph. Just going about his work, doing all that he can to avoid. He walks into the house one day to do his work, and lo and behold, none of the other servants are there. It's just the two of them. And she grabs his cloak. Now he has no choice. He runs. And she's left her holding the cloak. You can imagine, if you don't already know the story, how this might go. She's been scorned. The trials and temptations that really come after us, they don't like it when we refuse, do they? You ever been tempted and had it come back at you? Sure, we all have. There's a lot of power behind that. And she makes life very difficult. When we are scorned and don't get our way, we begin to turn to things we shouldn't turn to. We present untruths. We begin to lie. We begin to set things up to try to get back what we were trying to get. That's an exercise of freedom, but not the freedom God intends. When Potiphar gets home and he finds this story that he's being told, you would imagine how he would respond. I can't believe this slave who I thought was so loyal and so respectful, and I gave him all that I could give him, and he was doing so well, and he took the one thing that I told him he couldn't have. Does that ring any bells in your minds from another story that happened long before that? Everything we're given, and yet we want the one thing we can't have. Except in this case, Joseph didn't do that. But you can see how easy it would be to believe that because it fits with our nature and far too often our experience. He's thrown into prison. Potiphar's not going to have any of this, so he puts him in prison. And now you have to ask yourself, where's his freedom? What happened to doing the right thing? What happened to following in the way God would want you to follow and honoring somebody that's your master? And now you're punished for it? This is your reward for doing right? You're thrown in jail. You skip down to verse 19, chapter 39, where you read that about his fury, Potiphar's, and how he cast Joseph into prison. But in verse 21, we get the real point of this message this morning. But the Lord was with Joseph in prison. You see, you go all the way back to verse 2 when it said the Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did. Nowhere in this story does it say that the Lord left him. The Lord had been with him all along, and the Lord is still with him. Because when the Lord says he'll be with us, he is with us. He doesn't leave when the going gets tough. He doesn't leave even when we're in a position where it looks like there's no way out. He's still with us. And because he was with Joseph, and because Joseph apparently continued to do what the Lord told him to do, he found favor with the warden. So much so that the warden put him in charge of the other prisoners. If you're watching this story on TV or on the internet, if you're just checking this thing out, you got to be thinking, wow, this guy, he didn't stop. It's amazing. No matter what they throw at him, he just keeps going. They take him down, and he does what he wants to do down there. He does the right thing. And then they take him down lower, and he keeps doing the right thing. What's up with this guy? And it makes a fun story. It makes a really fitting story for church. But it also makes a really good example of the story many of us find ourselves in. Maybe not the exact circumstances. Maybe we're not actually sold. Maybe we're not actually enslaved. Maybe we're not actually thrown in prison. But do you see the parallels in a lot of experiences we have in life? Situation gets tough, and we keep slugging it out, doing the right thing. And then it gets tougher. Do we keep slugging it out? We feel like the freedom's been taken away, and a lot of times I think the temptation for us is to say, well, as soon as the situation gets better, I'll start doing that again. As soon as someone else takes care of my situation, I'll be better. How many of us as Christians say intentionally in our thinking, or maybe it's just a subtle thing in the back of our minds, as soon as the Lord gets me out of this, I'll get back to doing what he wanted me to do. Because obviously I can't do it in this situation. And so I pray to him, Lord, get me out of this. Help me get out of this so I can get back to doing what you want me to do. But the Lord was with him. The Lord never left, and neither did the Lord's desire for the way Joseph lived his life. That's why Joseph is held up as a hero. That's why we celebrate Joseph and what he did. After the text speaks of what happened with the warden and how Joseph found favor with him, it ends right where this story started. The very last part of chapter 39, it says, the Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. If you know this Joseph story, you know that years down the road, and after a great famine and a lot of hardship and a lot of changes, obviously he was out of prison and he was put back in charge of a lot of things, and he had the opportunity to bless the very brothers who sold him in the first place. Who does that? Who has been so wronged, and anybody objectively on the sidelines watching this play out would agree you were done terribly wrong again and again and again, why do you keep playing the same game by the same rules? And then, when given the opportunity to really get at the guys that did this to you in the first place, and they won't even know because they don't even recognize you, He blesses them. He blesses them. Come back to our story that we've been following in Acts. And we find that after this amazing event, where having been threatened and beaten and treated horribly by the officials, those first apostles got out and they kept right on doing what they were threatened and told not to do. Exercising their freedom, if you will. More so following and doing out of gratitude for what God had done for them. And the passage that we've spent so much time on ends the end of chapter 5 in Acts. And every day in the temple and from house to house they continued to teach and preach this message. Jesus is the Messiah. That'd be a great place for Hallmark to end the movie, wouldn't it? Wow. All this hardship, all this terrible stuff, just like the Joseph story, now it ends well. But real life doesn't always happen that way. And we find that in verse 1 of chapter 6, it says, as the believers rapidly multiplied, in other words, things were going really well. Maybe you catch the change in words there. Some call it a change in mathematics, arithmetic. God had been adding to their numbers. He'd been adding to their numbers. He'd been adding. Now all of a sudden, He's multiplying their numbers. And the rumblings of discontent begin. And we read in the first 6 verses of chapter 6 about how even though the church was growing like crazy, we'll experience growing pains. If church takes off and grows and grows and grows, you have all kinds of problems. Oh my goodness, we've got to grow our space. Maybe now we need more staff to meet the needs. Maybe the people aren't able to get everything that they were looking for. It's all good. It comes from a great problem to have, but it's nevertheless a problem. And we wonder, why does this keep happening? If we're doing what God's called us to do, if we're following in His steps, if He's with us and He's empowering us, why does this keep happening? And we find that in this story, just like in the Joseph story, we're given an opportunity. The apostles are given an opportunity. Joseph is given an opportunity to exercise the freedom for God's purposes or for our purposes, for their purposes. To sum up this story, the apostles say we need to continue what we've been called to do. We need to continue to teach and preach. That's our primary goal. That's our primary task given to us by God. And so they ask others, they invite others to come in to do it, and they begin to do it. And the message continues. Verse 7. So God's message continued to spread, and the numbers of believers greatly increased. And you get the real sense that because God was with them, even through the additional challenges, the presence of God brings about the purposes of God. So I ask you to consider something this morning. What do we do with the freedoms that we've been given? When we prayed last week, God, free me from these chains. You know, and we mentioned the various chains. If you weren't here, we talked about the chains of oppression. We talked about the chains of fear. We talked about the chains of maybe economic situations or relational situations. All sorts of chains that we carry, burdens upon us. And we We have before us two stories this morning telling us how some of God's early followers handled their freedoms. And so I invite you to consider these when you answer the question, how am I doing today with the freedoms God gives me when He answers my prayers? What do I do with it? Do I take it and run, so to speak? Do I thank Him and charge right back into what I was doing? Or do I stop and ask Him the question, why did you free me? Why did you take these chains away? What are you hoping to do now? It's a real question of freedom. It's a real question of choice on our part. It's a real question of whose purpose is primary in our lives. And do we connect the freedoms we're given with the purpose we're called to live out? Church, if we were to put in front of us in some way all the waking moments of our days, the purposes of God and the freedom of God, you're going to know there's going to be trials and temptations, because that's the way the kingdoms of the world work. The question is, what are we going to do with the freedom? And how are we going to view it when we know God is with us? Because if He is with us, apparently, we can succeed in everything, even if it doesn't look like the success of the world. What are we called to do? What are you being called to do today? What is God putting on your heart? What purpose is He giving you or reminding you of? Do you have the freedom to do it? How are you exercising that freedom? Do you need the freedom? Then let's ask for it. Let's pray for that freedom. But let's remember the one we're asking it from and His purposes for giving it. The presence of God is the place to be. Because when He is with us, no matter what we go through, He gives us the abilities to succeed according to His values and His purposes. May we be known as a church. May we be known as individual followers of Jesus, as a people who use the freedom we have to accomplish His purposes. Lord, how easy it is to forget